he serves as almost a Watson to the Sherlock of Andy Dufresne.
Yeah.
In the sense that he's the point of view that we're attached to as the reader, yet he's not the main character. Andy Dufresne is the main character. And much like that in a lot of Sherlock Holmes novels, Watson is the narrator, but Sherlock Holmes is the main character. Welcome, friends, to episode 268 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Stephen King's 1982 novella, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. Here we are with one of our favorite authors on this podcast that we have come back to many times, Stephen King, the one and only. And it's always fun, I think, to return. As soon as I started reading this thing, I was immediately like, oh, yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
He's so good.
Yeah, it's a warm cup of tea, right? Like, it's funny to think of the master of horror as being that, but it's something about the way that he tells stories. Like, you feel like you're in good hands right away, and this is a novella. It's short.
It's almost like he's good at this thing. This writing
Seems
thing.
Like he might make a go at it. This is short for him, right? This is like
incredibly short.
And we read The Body from the same collection. This is from different seasons.
Different seasons, which, by the way, I'm going to put in our bookshop, and there will be a link in the show notes if you wanted to get this collection. It also has Apt Pupil and I think one other in there that I'm forgetting the name of, but it's just a collection of short stories that are all not horror, although all of them have some horror elements. You might say, but yeah, his whole idea was to call it different seasons because he wanted it to stand out from the horror that he had been writing.
Yeah, and he has this theme. Hope Springs Eternal is the other sort of subtitle for this. Yeah. This, which is technically Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption.
Nope, just and Shawshank Redemption.
And Shawshank Redemption, sorry. And then he also has, for The Body, for example, it's Fall from Innocence, and then The Breathing Method is the other story you were mentioning.
Breathing Method,
That's a Winter's Tale. Apt Pupil is Summer of Corruption, so he has a season thing going on there, which is pretty fun.
Okay, yeah, I guess I didn't think about that. That's what the different seasons plays in. Cool. Shawshank Redemption. This is a movie I've seen several times. I had never read this novella, though, so I was excited to get into it. And, I can't remember the first time I saw this movie. I was definitely pretty young. And then I remember I watched it again when I was older, and I think I got a lot more out of it and liked it more than the first time I saw it. So I've had a bit of a journey with the film, and then I'm pleased to add on now the novella because once again I'm as we're reading it I'm like, man, so much of what I liked in the movie is right here in this book.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think the movie makes a lot of smart changes that we'll touch on next week when we get there, but very short for King, and I think there's something appealing about that. I think I'm so accustomed to the really long epics that Stephen King writes, and getting into something shorter, it's so welcoming. The story flies by, and I love that big chunks of time are passing, and it takes place in this prison where the inmates feel the same. Like time is just flying by at a rapid pace, and the story kind of emphasizes that as well. There wasn't a moment where I wasn't entertained and interested in the story.
It's just so readable, man. I just enjoy it. Talking about novellas is an interesting subject because at the time he wrote this, and you can tell when you read the afterword, novellas were not, they're just a weird length that a lot of people didn't know what to do with. They weren't selling very well. There wasn't a lot of markets that would take them. They're kind of too long for a lot of magazines. Not necessarily, but they're a tougher sell for them because they're longer. But then they're kind of too short to be published as standalone books. That was at the time. What's interesting is today, and in fact right now, it feels like we're kind of in a renaissance of novellas, specifically in genre spaces. I don't know if that's true in literary or not, but
and in what capacity are people reading these? On ebook, Kindles and that kind of thing, or where
they're getting releases? Former guest of the podcast, Fonda Lee, just had a novella come out called Untethered Sky, that is definitely got I think it's even a hardcover or at least a trade paperback.
I thought that was a full-length novel for some reason. That's interesting.
No, novella.
Wow.
There's this book that has been getting super popular because this tweet went viral about it by Bigolus Dickolus is the name of the Twitter account.
Nice.
Tweeted about how to lose the Time War.
I feel like I've heard of that.
I don't know if you've heard of this Twitter thing, but
not this Twitter thing.
Essentially, this fan account for Trigun with the user account Bigolus Dickolus tweeted just like an all caps like endorsement of this book, like go read it. It's by Amal El-Mukhtar and Max Gladstone, who are both former instructors of mine at Viable Paradise. So I was very kind of tied into it and excited for them because they're both wonderful people, and I was just excited to see them getting kind of noticed for this. And then, of course, this weird thing happens, which happens sometimes on the internet, where it's getting retweeted and it starts going kind of crazy, and then people in the book world are like laughing, and like I think the name is part of what made it so kind of mimetic. And then all of a sudden, articles start getting written about the fact that this is happening, because what happens is the book starts rising back up on the bestseller list, and this is a book that came out in 2019, and then goes mega viral, and then now all of a sudden, this novella, I think, got all the way up to like number 3 overall best-selling book on Amazon, and became a best-selling book years after coming out of its initial release, all because of this viral moment it had. And so much so that people are even joking because I think it leapfrogged a recent winner of the Pulitzer Prize. So people are saying that Bigolus Dickolus sells more books than winning a Pulitzer.
Wow. I think the only reason I'd heard about this book is because of you. I think you'd mentioned it to me in the past. I had no idea about this Twitter thing, though.
I think there was an adaptation, or at least an acquiring of rights announced for How to Lose the Time War. So this is how you lose the Time War. I think it's actually the name of it. Hopefully this will make it more likely to actually happen. You know what I mean? Because you never know just when an option happens. But hopefully the sort of viral nature of it will encourage someone to actually, make this thing into a reality. But anyway, all of that was kind of a digression. But my whole point was that's a novella. And it's one of the hottest selling books right now, period. And it's the hottest selling book in science fiction right now. And, short. And I think part of it is the proliferation of Audible, I should just say audiobooks in general, and then ebooks, like you said. And some might argue that some people want the shorter things nowadays. Maybe our attention spans are different. I don't know if that's true. But I hear that sometimes when people are trying to figure out why novellas are kind of having a moment. But Tor.com has become famous for, really quality novellas. I see a lot of authors writing them kind of in between longer works, which is interesting because that's what Stephen King says he did for this collection. When you read the afterword here, he says he basically wrote each of these in between longer novels, and often longer horror novels, and he was writing these as kind of a release and a break from horror for a minute here or there. So yeah, it's interesting. Novellas are definitely having a moment right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find myself reading. I mean, it's difficult to read a lot outside the podcast in general because we read so much, but I can definitely see
for us, just because neither of us are like hugely, fast readers like some people are.
Exactly, yeah. I could see myself being enticed into a shorter story, though, because of that, right? Because you can read it in between bigger projects and things like that for the podcast. Definitely a space I'm interested in reading, and, I'm excited to read Fonda's new work, so.
Yeah, it's a cool space. I definitely want to play around with writing some novella-length stuff. That's definitely something I'm interested in. But let's get focused in on what this one is. In the afterword, Stephen King talks about how he had an editor at the time. I think it was just after he sold Carrie, who was asking him, okay, what's next? What's your next thing that you're going to do? And from even that early on in his career, when he started pitching new ideas, his editors were hearing them and going, that's great. That'll probably sell really well. But just be aware you're at risk of getting pigeonholed. And getting pigeonholed as a horror writer, which especially at the time was not a genre that was doing particularly well. And so King was a little worried about that, but he has, over the course of his career, of course, I think kind of embraced being called a horror writer. But, like any artist, I think he likes to play around with other genres just to kind of prove that he can. There's always a little bit of like it's like he gets dared into these things sometimes when I'm reading him, because he's talking about these critics who say things like, oh, Stephen King could publish a laundry list right now or a grocery list and everyone would buy it. Because they get so convinced of his like stardom and everything, and that's why we get him writing under Bachman, right? Like where he's trying to prove his critics wrong. It gives him fuel, and then I think this is also an attempt to be like, I can write stuff and do well in areas that aren't horror.
And I think all four of these, really, three of them have been adapted. Yeah, and I think all three of them, people are surprised to hear King wrote. Often, like totally. I remember people talking about the Shawshank Redemption, and then when I found out King wrote it originally and talking to them about it, they're like, no, he didn't. They didn't believe me.
He's even talked about that. I think it's in On Writing. He tells us, he tells an anecdote about someone, I think it was meeting someone in a grocery store who asked him what he did for a living, and he said, oh, I'm an author. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing something I read a long time ago, so I may have this wrong, but she said something to the effect of, well, what do you write? And he said, well, I wrote Carrie, and I wrote It, and I wrote, like listed a bunch of his horror novels. And she said, oh, I don't like that horror stuff. I prefer stories that are more about, the triumph of the human spirit, like Shawshank Redemption. And he goes, oh, I wrote that one too. And she like didn't believe him.
That's awesome. That's great.
So that's the kind of, it's the funny thing about this, right? Like, I think it is like him trying to prove to himself and to his fans and to everybody, the world, that he can do other things. To,
I think, a great degree of success here. This is
clearly,
people say it's one of their favorite movies, and I think the movie has its
won
own
tons of awards.
Yeah, and the movie has its own success, and you can kind of separate it from King in that way. But ultimately, he wrote the source. You can tell that it's King. You can tell that it's his voice if you're looking for it, and yet it is so different, and it has, they say like, I like stories of the triumph of the human spirit, and you're like, well, a lot of his horror does that too, and like that's sure. Sort of, I think a lot of his books end up more hopeful than people think.
A lot of literature does that.
Yeah, sure.
It would be truly interesting to me to conduct a questionnaire, or even just like ask a bunch of Shawshank Redemption fans and say, hey, did you know that this is adapted from a novel? What percentage of them says yes? And then, truthfully, what percentage of them can name the author who wrote the novel it was adapted from? I don't know what that number would be, but I think it would be surprising.
Yeah, it's funny when that happens too. Like, there's so many that we've covered for the podcast that I think people would be surprised to know were based off books.
Yeah, this is one that I think people think of this as a movie. This is not one, much like Stand By Me. It's another one where I think a lot of people just don't even know that it's an adaptation.
Exactly. Yeah, the Rob Reiner film people think of more often, and they call it Stand By Me. Not a lot. You don't hear a lot of people walking around calling it The Body.
Sure.
With King too, I think as his legend has grown, and like the resurgence with like It, I think was like that coming out brought him to the forefront of people's minds again. I mean,
it's like he never really went away.
No, I don't think so either.
He has a period of a few years where you don't hear about a major adaptation, and then he comes roaring back. And he's been doing that for decades now.
But It being like one of the biggest movies of that year, and then like the hype true. For an It Part 2, and then
we capitalized on it for the podcast.
Yep. And you think of like the 80s nostalgia stuff that's going on, or has still been going on with Stranger Things, and definitely leaning heavily on Stephen King's work.
A lot of people look at that and say, oh, this is so heavily influenced by Stephen King. One of the characters is reading a King book in like the opening episode, and like there's some of that stuff where they're doing direct nods.
And since then, everything's been getting adapted from his work and readapted, new versions of it. And I think now, if you ask people if Shawshank was based on a book, more people would know that versus
maybe before.
I mean, maybe 10 years ago.
Certainly, the people, the circles we run in.
Sure. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you. You said warm cup of tea, familiarity. You found it readable. But like, what were some major takeaways from this book for you? How does it stand apart from other King you've read?
This is more similar to King, and then I'll get to what's different. But like the way that he's building dread in this story, I think like you get a lot of the tension building up, because at first he introduces a character who's like really charismatic. And I'm going to come back around to this and ask you if you feel like maybe any of the characters in the story have a shine to them or anything like that.
Oh, interesting.
Because, this is the greater Stephen King universe, so we have to think about that. But
it's true.
So he's building dread through the story. You're kind of like, okay, they're in a prison. What normally happens in a prison story, a prison break? You're like, so, are we going to see that happen? Is he gonna somehow get parole and get out and try to break other people out, that kind of thing? And so he's building the story along, and you can, and I love the way that he uses the narrator to create the mystery, so that we don't know exactly what's going on. He's like, our main character Andy's kind of difficult to discern what he's doing at times for the narrator, so we don't know what he's up to. And I think that keeps a mystery going for a lot of the story. But I don't know, I keep coming back to the ways that it's not different, because a lot of people will say it's different because it's more human and because there's not supernatural things. But in a lot of his stories, people overlook some of the worst cruelty in his stories are human made. And
time and again.
It feels a lot in the same vein as a lot of King, and it just so happens that prison and the seepage of time just like falling through your fingers, and the prison system in general is kind of the horror of the story, if you will.
I agree with that. I wouldn't say I necessarily felt a sense of dread reading it, but I will grant you that might be because I know Andy Dufresne escapes.
Sure.
Because I've seen the movie.
Yeah. Maybe tension's a better word.
Tension might be more accurate to what I was feeling. Definitely anticipation to the breakout. Obviously, I guess we're fully spoiling this thing, but it's a pretty old movie, and a lot of people, I think, are familiar with it. Our whole story is told through Red's point of view. One significant change, I think, is that this version of Red, I'm not sure, is the character also named Red in the movie? I think he might be.
I think so, yeah.
But this version of Red is a white man who is similar to the Morgan Freeman character, but different in a few, I think, notable ways. And he serves as almost a Watson to the Sherlock of Andy Dufresne.
Yeah.
In the sense that he's the point of view that we're attached to as the reader, yet he's not the main character. Andy Dufresne is the main character. And much like that in a lot of Sherlock Holmes novels, Watson is the narrator, but Sherlock Holmes is the main character. And so I think that dynamic is being played with here. And that was one of the things I found really interesting. It's first person. It's being written in sort of an epistolary form almost. It's like we're reading a manuscript that he is actively writing. He's referring to us, the reader, a few times, almost like it's written to us as a letter or something like that, or just you, the eventual reader. So I thought a lot of the form was a little novel to me. But like you said, there's so many familiar hallmarks of King's work. He does that blue collar New England voice so incredibly well, and it just immediately shines. Red is so distinct. His voice comes through so strongly. And then, of course, he's giving us direct narration about events he wasn't even present for. He's telling us exactly what was said in this courtroom and all this stuff. And it kind of stretches believability a little bit, but you're so in it that you don't really care. You're like, yeah, here we go.
And he's always kind of making it seem like it's been told to him by somebody else who was there, and he just remembers it to a T. And so it's this is gospel.
Andy Dufresne is a legend at this point, and he's like, yeah, this is all larger than life. Maybe it happened this way, maybe it didn't.
Yeah. And that analogy you made about Sherlock and Watson is so true. And this really does, the more I think about it, it is sort of a mystery novel as time goes on.
Totally. There's multiple mysteries that are at play here.
What happened? Did Andy actually commit a murder? Multiple murders?
Yeah, we lead off with the fact that supposedly Andy Dufresne murdered two people. Mm-hmm. And we believe Red. I think it's brilliant because he has Red admit to the fact that he actually did kill people. And he admits to that. And so we immediately believe him. We're like, okay, this guy's willing to admit to the things he's done. So he's playing it straight with me, right? He's not an unreliable narrator in that sense. And then he talks about how he believes that Andy Dufresne didn't commit the murders. And then we hear about immediately we lead off with this trial. There's this mystery at the heart of it of well, if Andy Dufresne didn't kill his wife and lover, who did?
And then we also get the mystery of kind of halfway through the novel, or maybe 3/4 of the way through the novel, he says Andy Dufresne escaped. And then we're like, how the fuck did he do it? And then the mystery unravels of how he made it out.
He loves to do that, right? He tells you the thing that you feel like I feel about it in multiple ways. On one hand, you're like, oh, isn't that the big reveal that he's going to escape? why not withhold that information as an author? But I think King is ahead of us in a sense because he's like, nah, you as the reader, you kind of know he's going to escape. So I'm just going to go ahead and get all that card's on the table. Now the reveal and the reason that you're going to continue to read is to find out how it happened, how we get from A to B. And he does this all the time in his, we've talked about this in other books, where he'll just reveal that a character died or something, and you're like, what? And then like you find out how.
Yeah, it's really smart because, like you said, he thinks there's some savvy readers out there who are going to pick up on it.
Totally.
And he's like, well, then let's just give it to you and then have you kind of, because you don't know how it happened. He knows that they don't know how it happened. So that's, it's fun that he plays with the form like that. And then, I mentioned it already, but just the way that he's like, it was 1935, it was 1940, it was 1950. And the way that he's sort of giving us all of that timetable so that when we learn about Andy's escape, we understand like the perseverance and everything. And this is like really getting into the end and the spoilers, but like it makes you think about like if you think you'd be capable of the patience, or the misdirection that's required to pull something like this off. Because I think a lot of people think if they went to prison, they could somehow find a way to sneak out. And you like to think like, oh, prison break, could I do it? And that kind of thing. Like this shows like you could if you had 27 or 37 years or however long it was.
Maybe. I mean, I definitely have a lot of thoughts about that.
Yeah, you could try.
It sounds to me like maybe we need to move into the plot. So I have it divided up into two chunks. I'll read each and we can react to them chronologically. Yeah.
Do we want to recommend I think a lot of people are familiar with this story, but do you recommend people read the book if they haven't?
Totally. I'm glad I've read this now as part of Stephen King's work, and I enjoyed the hell out of it, honestly. Is
there anything that you felt like you got out of the book that you didn't sort of already get out of the film?
I need to rewatch the film, obviously, to kind of refresh my memory, but Stephen King's language and his mastery of character building, he's doing he's spinning so many plates so expertly that it becomes easy to kind of like take it for granted. But, as I'm reading it, I'm just going like, wow, he's doing such a good job of like quickly characterizing so many people in distinct ways. I noted that he would do this thing where he would introduce a character and he would always find like one or two physical attributes that are so distinct. Like he's describing like a warden who has like a tight, taut like belly. But it's like, or I think it's like a beer belly almost though. But it's like for some reason it's like tight, and like this guy has like he's very like rigid, and so it's such a perfect little descriptor. And he doesn't describe everything else about the guy, but just like one or two little physical details, and then he'll give us like a line about his personality and what kind of man he is, and like those two things, it's like in 2 sentences you get such a clear image of a character. And that's impressive stuff when authors can do that.
Yeah, I agree. He's always been good at sort of, the archetype characters that I feel like you typically see in other stories. He takes them and makes them feel more realized very efficiently, like you're mentioning.
It's a magic trick, man, to convince us that these people are real, and he does such a good job of that. Like these people just feel like real people.
This is a good point too, before we jump into plot, to talk about kind of some of the things that I felt were dated in the story, because there's a lot of older King that you have to kind of grapple with that.
82 King, so pretty, it's been over 40 years since this book was written.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So yeah, the depiction, I mean, like, as realistic as some of it is, it's the way that he goes about it sometimes, talking about certain subjects such as rape, gang rape, and prison, and some of the things that we know goes on that are, obviously terrible. But the way that he kind of plays with them sometimes, and the way that he talks about some of the characters and like sexuality in general.
Pretty cavalier with it, yeah, making some assumptions. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, like, King does this a ton, and I give him credit because like he doesn't shy away from what he knows even at the time are going to be controversial, hot button topics. But because of that, some of it has not aged well, and you can look back and like throughout his work, you're going to find a lot of things that I think, today you look back on and it's cringy or honestly kind of offensive. It just wasn't something that he necessarily, I think as a human being, a flawed individual, didn't have as much awareness of, or if he was aware of it, maybe he hadn't like come around to, the harm that certain depictions can be imposing. And maybe he didn't care at the time, and maybe he does more now. Seems like he does more now. But, you know, it's a different time, too. Like, it's easy for us to point fingers now in 2023, but, like, life was different in 1982, especially for this white author from New England.
Yeah. So I think it's just important to point out whenever, because we're heaping a lot of praise on him, there's obviously things that we're like, you know, oof, you know, you have to kind of deal with this when you read some older stories in general, and King tends to have, you know, some of it pop up.
Yeah, especially older stories written by white men.
Yeah.
You know, to put it bluntly. And honestly, there's a lot of stuff around race here that I definitely found myself uncomfortable with, terminologies being used and words being used, and then just also like one thing, it's like he's I think right in the fact that he is representing that there are a lot of racist people in the world, and a lot of it's very casual, and a lot of it, you know, comes out of people's mouths, sometimes even characters that we otherwise like. And so I think he does a good job of like he never shies away from like reflecting how people talk, and he listens to how people talk in the real world, and he puts a lot of that kind of stuff in his books. And so you get a lot of real world racism just kind of plainly stated in a lot of these, and you see it here. I mean, he's talking about people who are in prison. So, like, of course, it's going to be a very rough crowd, right? It's going to be a lot of like people who aren't being super careful with the way they talk. That's just going to be accurate to the setting too.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, you know, some people look at it and think, oh, he's unflinching, and the way that he's talking about these things were probably at the time even more crazy, because people weren't talking about this kind of stuff in this way.
And I'm sure that's how he was thinking about it at
exactly
the time.
Yeah. So you're talking about, you know, the type of characters that are going to be in a prison, and then you get this Andy Dufresne character who like sort of develops a library and some of this other stuff. I'm going to be excited to dig more into that. Let's jump into plot.
All right, let's get into it. So, in 1947 in Maine, Andy Dufresne, a banker, is tried and convicted of the double murder of his wife and her lover, despite his claims of innocence. He is sent to Shawshank State Penitentiary to serve a double life sentence. There he meets Red, a prisoner who is known in the prison for his ability to smuggle in contraband items. Andy asks Red to get him a rock hammer, which he uses to shape rocks he collects from the exercise yard into small sculptures. He later requests a large poster of Rita Hayworth, which he hangs on the wall above his bed. Over the years, Andy uses his financial knowledge to assist various prison staff. Okay, so let's stop there. Talk about him arriving at the prison and his early interactions with Red.
Yeah. So we introduced like a magical genius character, right? Like a character that like knows everything useful. He fights back and never turns away from a fight, because that's sort of.
But he's not like physically talented at fighting. He just has he has this indomitable will, and that is repeatedly like stated by Red as like. He walks around with this light inside of him and this freedom that he just carries with him.
Other people are sort of downtrodden and looking at their shoes and shuffling around, and he walks around with purpose. Like he's going to get out of here, or he at least like is making the best of living his life. You know, the get busy living or get busy dying is like a really famous line from this.
Yeah. What a great line. And that's Stephen King. Like a lot, when I Googled it, because afterwards I was like, this isn't him quoting something, right? This is a Kingism. It is. And when I Googled it, it's the vast number of attributions when you see it, attribute it to characters from Shawshank Redemption, the film. So this is a Shawshank Redemption, the film, quote, you'll see everywhere. And then every now and then you'll see someone admit in there, like, actually it's Stephen King from the novel, you know what I mean? But like, it's pretty rare. And it like, that's one of King's great lines, I think. Get busy living or get busy dying. That's a great line.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, it's carpe diem, right? It's all of these different things we've heard before, just said in like a really fun and clever way. So like for that to sort of be, and that doesn't pop up in the book till almost the very end. We don't hear that, which I think is also, you know, really powerful way to end the book off. But, you know, you see this character that kind of embodies that throughout. You know, he's trapped in this prison system. He finds ways to navigate, you know, the higher ups and the gangs that are coming after him. It's clear that he's a thinking man. Like he wants to work on geology. He wants to start a library, and he's also giving. Like he's like to the rest of the prison. It feels, whether selfish or not, it feels like even when he's out, he wishes that he could, you know, do good for all these other people as well.
It's so smart because he uses all these opportunities. Like they're all done for a very specific reason. I'm looking at it as like from an author's point of view. Like, he outsmarts characters a lot, but he does it in a way that isn't like pretentious or necessarily like lording knowledge over people. He's generous. He sees other prisoners as human beings. We one of the early interactions he has with the prison staff is him negotiating so that all of his like coworkers, he calls them, can get beers. And you know, Red even talks about how this becomes like part of his legend. Everybody loves him.
Yeah.
And part of it you could look at and say like, oh, he understands that, you know, you want to have everybody love you in prison. That's going to make it for a better life for you. But on the other hand, it's just making him out to be this good dude, which makes us in turn like him.
And you know, he gets this bottle of liquor, I guess, of some kind, and drinks like half of it and gives the rest of it out, or drinks part of it and gives the rest out once a year or twice a year, something like that.
Yeah, Jack Daniels, which I took note of because famously in The Shining, Jack is his drink, and I think it's come up in multiple King books where Jack Daniels is like a favorite of a lot of characters, and I was thinking about, just because like I am kind of a whiskey nerd, Jack Daniels is one of those, like...
It's more accessible, right?
When you're first starting out with whiskey and you first start getting into bourbon and that kind of stuff, like, Jack Daniels is one that is, like, it's not bottom shelf, but it's accessible. So it's a little more expensive, so it feels like you're kind of, like, splurging a little bit to get a Jack and Coke rather than just a whiskey and Coke. And you can notice the difference, too. I think you drink a Jack and Coke and you can tell that it tastes different than your standard well drink. So... yeah, it's like the blue collar version of like a nice whiskey, and without going to places like fancy scotches where you're kind of getting into territory that a lot of like people on lower income artists aren't going to be able to afford them.
Yeah,
and so it's kind of excludes people in a way, you know.
Yeah, and this idea of him sharing that kind of beverage too is like, it's not like a couple of beers is one thing when he's working with them and stuff, but sharing, because you know how much it costs to smuggle this money. He smuggled money in, and how much it costs to get each and everything in prison. There's like a tax on everything. So for him to spend his own money on it and then also share it.
So Red is the man who can get it for you, is how we're kind of introduced to him, and he's good at smuggling in these things, but. Coming back to the whiskey, I love the description where Red says, like, he has this odd relationship with drinking. He only does it a few times a year, but when he does, he kind of drinks to excess, it sounds like. And he even says, like, this is the kind of relationship you only get if you've been bitten by the bottle. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because we've seen time and again Stephen King talking about alcoholism and addiction. And the implication is that Andy Dufresne has had problems with drinking in the past, and has developed methods to like make sure it doesn't get out of hand for himself.
Yeah, and we learned that the reason he can't like vehemently deny everything that happened is because he was wasted when some of the stuff happened to his wife. And
such a Stephen King thing, right? Like, a lot of what got him into trouble was the substance, right? Because he got so drunk that he can't remember for sure certain things, and that makes him look super guilty.
Right. So yeah, that's what bit him, obviously. Like that's and so like he's not interested in drinking most of the time.
Yeah, it could be that, but I also just think he might have had some actual alcoholism problems.
Probably. Well, if you're getting wasted often enough, you know.
Yeah. So we learn about this rock hammer, and we get the introduction of this idea that maybe he's going to start the long process, right? And we even hear Red say something about like, oh, it's going to take him 1,000,000 years if he were to try and like chip through the wall. So it kind of telegraphs what's going to go on here a little bit, especially if you know the story already, but assuming you don't. He loves like geology, and he starts talking about how like water can wear down stone over millions of years. And he starts getting these stone washing blanket things. I forget what they're called, but they're like, you like rub stones with them, and then over time you'll like rub them down into like smooth stones and more beautiful gemstones, I guess. Yeah,
and he's finding like quartz out in the yard that he then does this with, and he gives Red a few and gives some out to the people around him.
And I can't remember if any of this is in the movie or not, but I think this is all like such a cool metaphor, and he's using it as like a literary device, right? Like this process is what he is doing in his escape attempt, and he's establishing that, but it's also just like the nature of trying to achieve anything monumental where your progress is very incremental. And I think this is something that authors have a very intimate familiarity with. And I was thinking about the process of writing a book and how often it can feel like that, where you're just doing little things that over time you look back on and you can be like, wow, look how far I've come. But along the way, it's a bunch of tiny little steps, and it takes patience, and it takes, commitment, and a lot of the stuff that I think he is like playing with. Like, that's one of Andy Dufresne's superpowers, is his ability to sustain long-term focus and commitment to something like this.
Yeah. So Andy Dufresne is he's very likable, he's very smart, but he's also extremely persuasive. And this is where I'm going to bring this back up, is, do you think that Andy Dufresne or any other characters that we encounter have any shine or any supernatural? Is there anything else going on? Are there unseen hands at play in this story, or do we think it really is just like a bottle story for King?
I didn't think of any characters as necessarily having shine. The one thing I did find myself entertaining was this random act of violence that does kill his wife and this lover. We later find out is this like guy who just robbed people and like seems like a kind of a piece of shit, and like that kind of shit happens all the time for sure in real life. But that random act of evil I've seen tied into some sort of supernatural element in so many other books, where like some outer force is maybe whispering to these characters and like getting them to do things.
Henry Bowers.
Yeah. You could almost see like, is there a force like a Pennywise or somebody like that who is influencing these people to commit these random acts of evil, and maybe Andy Dufresne got caught up in that.
Yeah.
Now, but that's not in the book. That's kind of more me reading
Sure.
between the lines and thinking about how it could be.
It's like, if you see evil in the story, it could be twofold. It could be evil of human beings, which is totally true, but then also like outside influence and just pushing them in that direction. Like you think of the Warden too. And like how the Warden basically is using Andy to do free, tax work and
he's laundering money for him essentially, and like helping him figure out legal ways to launder money.
Stocks and stuff like that. He's helping people with. He keeps track of that kind of stuff in the newspaper. So he's an asset, and he has complete power. The power dynamic, complete control over him. Right,
and that it's such an intelligent, interesting twist on this sort of dynamic to have Andy Dufresne in a moment of like trying to sort of befriend the prison staff and like see if he can kind of rope them in and make life better for himself and more comfortable. He ends up giving them this service, and he doesn't realize how this service is going to in turn be used against him, in the sense that the Warden doesn't want to let him out. And it becomes clear that the Warden has a vested interest in keeping him imprisoned and not letting this like truth get out, because the Warden's a shitty person, and he's a villain in this book. And that's another thing that I think does age pretty well, honestly. And that's that this book is an indictment on the prison system, and it talks about for-profit prisons and the corruption that is rampant. And honestly, the sort of laughable idea about rehabilitation and how this system stays with people and ruins their lives. Now, he doesn't get into like whether or not it's just. Like, that's kind of like beside the point. Like, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, as I guess the implication we get. He just looks at like the reality is like, here's what happens when you put someone in prison for 20, 30, 40 years. And how it can, and then you let them out one day and they are essentially still in prison because they have like forgotten how to be free. And like, there are things that they miss about being back inside. And then even the people who are running the prison, like it definitely blurs that line of like, who's the villains, who's the criminals here, because you have a lot of people doing criminal shit who are running the prisons. Yeah. And just to relate it to today, like you said, with it being relevant still, like the idea of privatized prisons, and they're incentivized to be filled, and they're making money because of it. People talk about it being like modern slave labor of today. Yeah. is through the prison systems. Yeah. I mean, King talks about that a few times as well. Sure. Interesting to hear him. I don't know the accuracy of this, but when he goes back and is talking about like the 1700s or I think the 1800s in Maine, and the ways that like you would dig your own like basically you dig your own prison in one day, and then they'd put bars over top of you
and as big and as wide as you could make it.
I bet it was probably true.
Probably very powerful for the story.
I mean, the way we dealt with prisoners, like, you think it's bad now, like, it's just worse over time.
Yeah, and that's what he's getting at is like, you're innocent or guilty, period. There's no like sort of like, oh, maybe maybe we can find new evidence.
Once you're guilty, almost anything can happen to you and no one gives a shit.
Right. So you're either put to death or put in a prison, and then this prison is you in one day dig a hole as fast as you can, as big and as wide as you can, because you're going to be in there for who knows how long. They put bars over top of it, and then they throw you some water once a day, and then they might throw you some moldy bread and stuff. And this gets into another thing I wanted to mention. There's a character that supposedly lived down in the hole, which is in Shawshank. It's not quite as bad as what we were just describing, but it's that kind of thing where you're in a hole, solitary confinement.
I think in a lot of prisons they call solitary the hole. I think maybe it's a reference to that original practice. Honestly, I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. They talk about someone who survived the longest in there. Someone made it 7 years, and it was a Durham boy who went in a young man. And I'm like, this just feels so specific, like it could be another character crossing over from another King story.
Is it? Did you look into it?
I don't know. No, I mean, I tried. I didn't want to look into it too much because I haven't read all of King, but it definitely feels like. At first, I was like, are they talking about? Because I was thinking of Derry when they said Durham, and I was like, is that?
Yeah. I mean, Shawshank in general has popped up in other King works and been referenced. So you're right. This is totally in his universe. These characters just seem to be not affected by the supernatural shit that goes on in his universe, but they're living in that world. It seems like.
The way that the story sort of develops over time too is like it starts out, you're kind of seeing these characters interact, and it's just survival, and then they've been in there, and then it's like again, this book is very short, and by like a quarter or a third of the way in, we've transitioned to the point that the characters have been in here for like 10, 15, 20 years, depending on which part of the story he's talking about at any given time. And you just think about like how long that is, and how anyone doing anything for 20 to 30 years. And obviously we've talked about the escape attempt, and it's coming, but like we don't know the entire story, but you think of these characters and how much it changes you that after that period of time. And then to keep that light that we're talking about for Andy, that's why he's a legend that he is, I think, because he helps them at the library to study for education on when they get out, to having a degree or having a high school diploma, that sort of thing. So he builds that legend to the point that you're like, this character is like a superhero in everybody's eyes, and they all love him, so that's why they all know about him.
A couple of things come to mind. One, whenever you make a character into a big reader, and like especially someone who like shares books with other people, you're going to endear yourself to the readers of the book you're writing. That's I think a little trick that I see King use a lot, and other authors have definitely picked up on it.
I mean, like all of us reading the book are like, oh man, like if I was in prison, that's the only thing I could do is read books. I'd be reading everything.
I'd be reading all the time. Yeah. It's like the one thing people think about and go like, oh, I can have time to read.
Yeah.
It's funny. I love the way he conveyed that passage of time where he would repeatedly touch on like the World Series and like where certain sports teams were at, and then political stuff. He would like talk a little bit about politics, but it was always so interesting because like you could tell that it was like on the outside world, this is the stuff you were dealing with. To us on the inside, it wasn't like we weren't necessarily following it, but like, so it kind of created also that separation of like, this is how you can be familiar with what it was like in this period, but recognize that wasn't necessarily what we were engaging with, because we're almost in a separate world over here in confinement.
Right.
So in October of 1967, Andy tells Red about Peter Stevens, a pseudonym under which Andy had sold his assets and invested the proceeds. Andy tells Red that one day Peter Stevens will own a small seaside resort hotel in Zihuatanejo, Mexico. On the morning of March 12, 1975, after 28 years in prison, Andy disappears from his locked cell. After a search, Warden Samuel Norton discovers that the poster pasted to Andy's cell wall covers a man-sized hole. Andy had used a rock hammer to slowly chip a tunnel through the wall. In September of 1975, Red receives a blank postcard from McNairy, Texas, a tiny town on the Mexican border, and surmises that Andy crossed the border there. In March of 1977, Red is paroled. He finds a letter wrapped in plastic addressed to him from Peter Stevens, inviting him to join Andy in Mexico and $1,000 in cash. The story ends with Red preparing to break his parole and follow Andy to Mexico. So we got the whole escape attempt to get into here, but I think we should definitely focus a little bit on Rita Hayworth and this poster, which is in the title of the entire novella, so very important, clearly. And then, like, interestingly, by the time he escapes, it's actually been shifted to a Linda Ronstadt poster.
Yeah, it was Marilyn Monroe at one point. I like the way he does that as well. It's like he transitions the posters to different characters. But the Rita Hayworth specifically, and it being part of the title, he talks about how when he looks at her, he feels like he can he can go right into the painting or right into the picture and go like right through it and be out on the outside. And the way that is exactly what he does. He goes through this picture and finds himself on the outside. And so I think that's the significance in the title.
I mean, it's a clever use of an image to convey something more, and that's, I think, the way that he's able to hold on to hope of having a quote unquote normal life to, being able to live on the outside. It becomes representative of that to him. And yeah, I mean, that's so perfect too, that it doubles as, of course, it covers up the hole, but also, like you said, it's thematically relevant that's where the hole is.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing that a prisoner might hang up in there and it wouldn't be, it wouldn't stand out too much.
He does such a great job of describing the like economics of prison and the way the guards deal with stuff, and like when they are going to choose to care and when they're going to choose not to care. And like he's totally convincing in the way that he describes how, like, you just can't care about everything as a prison guard, and you have to let certain things slide. It's just part of, like, getting on. And, like, if it's not hurting anybody, sometimes you just kind of let things go. And it seems like these posters are kind of that. But, of course, that also leaves the space for Andy Dufresne to do what he did.
Yeah. One of my favorite exercises in reading this story, too, was seeing King basically say, like, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. And then you could find little parts throughout the story where he found loopholes or he found like ways where it doesn't make a lot of sense, and then he patches those. So it'll be like, it would have been so terrifying for Andy, because if he had been paroled, they would have, cleaned his entire room, and when they moved that poster, they would have been meticulous, and they would have found it, and then he would have had more time in jail, and he would have never gotten out, and that kind of thing. So he goes around like finding this throughout the story, like because he wants to make it work. So a good example of this too is he's talking about how he had his friend set up this fake identity and invest all this money. And then he's got like so many reasons why, and like they thought this out. And it feels very much like a Sherlock Holmes story, where it's like, you go back and you reverse engineer the story to make it fit perfectly, to where it's like, well, so-and-so died, but then it's still being controlled by, it's still in this guy's name, so nothing would revert and everything would stay in his name in the safety deposit box, and the key was put in a very specific place. And like the ways that you can feel him doing this too is he's like, anything that I had invested in could have bombed, and that's why he's so invested in looking at keeping up with the markets and stuff like that. It's because he wants to know that his $4,000 or however much it was that he invested in, like, what was it, the 40s or 50s when he went 40s, in? So that it was still like steadily increasing in value, because like he couldn't touch it on the inside or else it would be seized. So like just a lot of interesting moments where you can kind of see him going back and being like, well, I have to have a moment where he explains this and explains this to make the mystery and make all of the dots connect. And, and in that way, it's fun to see how he does it, and kind of, because we think about story so much, we think about this kind of stuff, but it makes, the way that he introduces it to the audience is like, it's compelling, and it's fun to hear how he figured all this stuff out.
It does multiple things at once, right? Because it does all of that. It is a little bit of the reveal of like Sherlock Holmes revealing how the crime was done. It's like him, the reveal of how the escape attempt actually happened. But like he's also selling us on the risk that was involved with it, how there was a gambling element to it, that you had to get a little bit lucky. But that also like shows how bold it was and how brave it was, and how it wasn't just like, he did this because it was the only option he had. It's like, no, he could have done other things that, maybe not as risky. But on the other hand, he also like does a couple smart things in showing how unjust the system is, convincing us that Andy Dufresne is innocent, and then showing how this corrupt warden is unwilling to let him bring this new evidence to light. So at that point, we're so ready for him to break out. Like, we're 100% on his side. So there's no, like, any of us, like, you don't have to take a lot to convince me, but, like, anybody reading this now is not like, going, oh, you should just write out write it out in the system, because like we're all looking at this and saying it's wrong.
Yeah.
So of course we're all cheering for Andy when he gets free.
Yeah, and we get the interesting details as it goes of like, how he was chipping off pieces and having it like in his pants and sort of loosen, like just very, very slowly, like that sort of plodding work, and how long that would take, and the amount of
power of, and that all goes back to the, rubbing a stone with a coarse paper and doing stuff in very, very small incremental things to where no one notices. And that's the superpower of Andy Dufresne.
And how careful he was too, right? Like he could have allowed the debris to fall into the hole, but instead he brings it out, all of it out.
He's worried about the noise.
Even when he talks about how Red talks about how he knows that at one point that the hole was completed, but he delayed leaving. Like he kind of was like scared to take the leap because he knew he only had one shot at it, and there were so many variables. Like,
and he talks about how there's things he didn't know. Like,
once he got to the tube, like, was there going to be a grate in the piping?
How could you know? Yeah, but you also understand why he got to the point where he was willing to try it.
Yeah. Definitely.
Again, it shows like the bravery, that element of like you have to get over that, and that like you could get trapped in there. Like you don't know if once you get in there if you're gonna be able to breathe. Like that's scary. One
of my favorite parts of the book, by the way, is when the warden sends one of the guards in, and he's like, "There's shit everywhere, shit."
He says, "Oh shit, it's shit."
Yeah.
I love that line. Oh shit, it's shit.
Red's out there like cracking up, hardest laugh he's ever had in prison, and he gets put in solitary. But like, just that what he's able to, the hope he's able to give these characters to in that way. Like he got out and got away, and they didn't find it for such a long period of time. And they talk about like Red's like I would have frozen from claustrophobia like 10 times, and because he has to squeeze himself in these tiny little walls and then into the plumbing.
It's like this pipe
on the way out.
It's like sewage.
Yeah, and he's just crawling through it.
And I think that makes it in the movie. Andy Dufresne crawled through 500 yards of shit and came out clean or something on the other side. Like and that line's from the book. And
the magical part of the story too is after he escapes from the pipe, how does he escape also the pursuers, and like he's not like either a naked guy or somebody in prison clothing just like running around, and he had to travel 30 miles, we heard, to get to the key. And then it's like, how did he get clothes? How did he get a car? Or how did he travel around? And he did it though, because he gets that postcard, and that's the big moment when Red gets that postcard. You're like, oh man! Like,
ultimately, it's just he did it. And
I felt myself like it really gave me that release and that fun sense of this story and like the joy that it brings, and you're just like and I think that's part of the reason why this movie is so endearing to people, because maybe they haven't experienced the book, but the movie has that as well. It's like that. The indomitable human spirit, right? And then the bravery that it takes to do something like this to get out of the system, but ultimately like looking back at Red and thinking like if he ever gets out, like that connection that they formed, that brotherhood that they have, how he's like waiting in the wings to like help Red have a better life as well.
We love to see smart characters get the better of corrupt, like domineering systems and characters who are representative of those systems. So it's such a joy to see a character like this get the better of the warden, and King knows that. It's not usually something that we see King do, but we've seen this in many other kinds of stories, and he leans into it here.
And the story ends with Red really thinking about like what Andy gave to everybody and what's important, and that idea of hope. And I think it's even written in the letter about like having hope. And then that comes back to the subtitle of the book, which is Hope Springs Eternal, and just the way that, I think all of us hope to be an Andy Dufresne, in the way that like you can give hope to other people and be optimistic about things that seem like there's no good way out. And it's a bigger metaphor than just like a prison break. It's about humanity in general. Totally.
I love there's a little detail that he takes some of the rocks, like some of his favorite rocks that he's got from all over time. He took them with him.
That's awesome. Yeah.
He's just like, I'm keeping these. I love that. And then, like talking about like the end, the book takes an interesting turn because Red gets unexpectedly paroled. He's been in jail for 40 years at this point. And he talks about how he becomes this like bagman at a local supermarket. And he says like, oh, you might have even interacted with me if you were in this part of Maine and you wouldn't have even known it or something. And interesting to hear him immediately sort of fall into this like, I started thinking about committing crimes to get back inside, because I was so used to the life I'd lived for so long with the structure. And the thing that keeps him from doing it is the way he keeps thinking about Andy Dufresne and how his like just determined pursuit of freedom over those many years took such a sustained effort that I think Red is sort of shamed by it, in the sense that he's like, well, I can't go back in, not with what Andy did to get out.
Yeah. And to explain more of like why Red wanted, he felt he was uncomfortable, right? It wasn't just the routine. It was also like the world was really big and different than when he went in. And
he's been away from it. Yeah, totally. And it would be. And this is a real problem. Recidivism is such a huge problem. And, a lot of it is, I'm sure, this exact reason. I know that's something that the movie deals with well. And I did read, one thing I did read about the writing of this is that he completed writing it in 1975, but he came back in 1977 and added an additional chapter. I didn't see that confirmed, but I think it's this final. I think the book basically ended where we leave off the manuscript, quote unquote, that Red is writing. But then we get this follow-up chapter where we get it detailed of him actually going to join Andy in Mexico. And it's a little more hopeful, I think. And it leaves us in this like uplifting note of him deciding to risk it all and try and cross. He's breaking his parole. He's risking it, but he's risking it in pursuit of this life of like true freedom and seeing his friend again. And we don't get it confirmed that he's going to, but of course I think we all want to believe he makes it, and they end up being able to run this resort together.
I love seeing that like the perseverance and the determination rubbed off on Red too, because he chooses to visit every single like field with a fence, basically with a stone fence in that entire area.
It's not easy. Yeah.
He's like, there's like 100 fields and farms and things like this that match that description. And then eventually he finds it, and after, years of doing this, and he's talking about like this is his hobby, this is his determination, the thing he does when he's not at work, and he finds the volcanic rock that marks where the key was, and there's a letter there for him with the money, and I love the way that sort of rubs off on Red. It
just reminds me like this is such a it's become such a part of culture now that I think it's a Family Guy bit that I kept thinking of where they're making fun of this moment in Shawshank Redemption, but I thought of it when I was reading the book too, where he picks up the letter and he reads it, and Andy says something about like, you remember the town, and and then he's like, oh, of course I do, Zwantanejo or whatever. But like in the Family Guy bit, he just like goes, shit.
Yeah.
Because he forgot it, right? And I was just laughing because I'm like, that would be me. It'd be like, oh, you remember the name of the town, right? And I'd be like, God damn it, what was it?
But I feel like you look at a map and you go through all the cities, eventually you'll figure it out. You got to have that determination. Yeah. If you found the rock, you'd have the determination to find the city.
Yeah, maybe, man. I just think that's funny, man.
Funny.
But I like the idea of him returning to this and realizing that he wanted to have the more hopeful ending, because I think it is appropriate for the story. I think it honestly was necessary in it. It was kind of a second ending, but I liked what it did for the novella.
I just thought it was a fun mechanism too, because it's like it's so final in that chapter, and I was like, oh, so the story's over, and then he's like, I never thought I'd pick this manuscript back up again, and he's like, I snuck it out just the way that Andy Dufresne snuck the money in, so he's like, he had to shove it up his butt to get this manuscript out, and he's like, I had changed the wording so that if they did find it on me, it wouldn't have implicated Andy, but like,
I love that, like dealing with it like it's this real tangible item that was actually potentially at risk to getting Andy Dufresne captured again, and that plays with that sense of like, people probably read this thing and go like, is this true? Is this real?
Yeah. I couldn't help but think like how, like him writing this in prison and like just the risk of it being found. He talks about how he thought about destroying it many times, but like, I don't believe that a character, like it pushes believability, I'll say, that a character would want this manuscript to exist when they could write a manuscript again when they got out. And so, maybe some of the details would be hazy.
Right.
But the alternative is having this super risky document.
I mean, the one thing I will say, though, is that, like, lots of people write stuff in prison. Like, you hear about a lot of, like, Martin Luther King wrote a bunch of stuff in prison. It's like a lot of people take I mean, you have time, right? And if you have access to writing implements, that's one of the things you can do.
I guess I just mean like it's hard to believe that like after like he wouldn't destroy it or something just because like that could have.
Well, I think King thought about that and was like, well, I need to sell a reason why.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people are going to question it.
But anyway, I thought it was cool that he picks it back up and he's like, I never thought I'd write about this again, but I'm actually on my way to Mexico and
yeah.
I like to think that there's no question in my mind that he makes it to Andy and they chop it up together and have a good time.
Yeah. I mean, it ends on hope, right? It ends on Red has found something to live for. After being so disconnected from life, and he's like at a time now. And there's this really like affecting moment where he talks about how one day, this is when he's in prison, he looks in the mirror and he knows that he entered prison as like an 18-year-old or 19-year-old, boy, essentially. And now he's like 40 and he can see the old man inside waiting to come out. And that was such an affecting line. And like, as you start getting older, that is a scary thing that can happen sometimes, is you can start being like, oh man, I can see that I'm getting older and like I can kind of project what that might look like in the next 20 years. That's scary shit.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of that sense of loss that we all have about aging, and then you put that in prison where your life is getting spent within these walls.
That's what I was going to say too, is like that is the ultimate theft that you can do. I know obviously it's a form of punishment, and I don't necessarily believe in the death penalty, so this is a better alternative than that. But it's to take someone's time away from them. And I heard something recently that was talking about like, any crime that just has a fine, no matter how large the fine, is only a punishment for the middle and lower class, right?
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Upper class can choose to commit a crime and pay off whatever they need to pay off. And this idea of like time being this commodity that all of us have, that is always going away, but then when put up against something like this, and especially when it's unjust, from Andy Dufresne's case of someone being in prison for the wrong reasons, just seeing that time go by it's horrifying. It's one of the scariest things that there is, because time is all we have.
And that's in one way that I think Red is still a very interesting character, and bringing it back to him, because he did commit murders. He talks about how he was trying to kill his wife. I think it was like a brake line thing, like he cut her brake line or something. And then she ended up having someone else in the car with her, and like multiple people got killed.
I think that they hit somebody else too, and the other person in the car died. Yeah.
And he's like, I did it, and I feel terrible, and I would have done it differently, and I wouldn't have done it, the same thing if I could do it again. But it's like something he owns that he did. And so it creates such an interesting dynamic, because it's like this guy killed multiple people, and I think a lot of people would look at this character and say they're irredeemable, they should rot in prison forever, or face a death penalty. And yet, King makes us feel for him. We grow attached to Red. We see what kind of man he is over time. And the idea of rehabilitation circles back at the end, right? Is we're like, how do we feel about Red now? And like, we want him, I think by the end, we're cheering for Red. We want him to have freedom again and to enjoy life. And that's something that a lot of people struggle to like look at somebody and see the chance for redemption or for becoming reformed in any way, especially in our country. I think that's a thing that a lot of people struggle with.
It's difficult because there's cases of people maybe that would get out and wouldn't be remorseful and wouldn't be all of that. But
totally, that's why it's such a complicated issue, right? And you see tons of times where people are obviously just awful, and they're going to continue to be awful.
And so it's a fine line to walk, but to see King write a story...
But a one-size-fits-all justice system just doesn't work for that reason, right?
It's clear, yeah. And so for King to write a story of a murderer, from the point of view of a murderer, that's kind of recounting the tale of somebody who wasn't, and for us to be close to a character like that and to see a redemption in that person, and honestly to get the internal monologue of somebody saying like, I regret it and I would do it differently, and kind of taking that as like gospel, and knowing that that's like that they really mean that's who that character is. It's such an interesting exercise that people aren't willing to do for some people, like you said, in prison that never will get a second chance.
Yeah, and often for much more minor crimes. And I mean, I think you could have a legitimate debate about whether or not even a character like Red is it, I think there could be people who would say like, no, that person should never get the benefit of the doubt again, because look at the deaths they caused. They've robbed those people for a chance at having a life. So, I mean, it's even debatable with a character like him, but there's also lots of people in real life who've done much more minor things who get stuck in these systems, and the systems are designed to keep them in many ways. Yeah. And are successful at doing that.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I think this conversation that we're having about Red is not one that many have about Red after the story. I think a lot of people are like happy that Red gets out and reconnects with Andy. So like you said, interesting sort of thought experiment going on here.
And one thing that is not touched a lot on in this novella, but I think becomes more present in the film, is race and the role that plays in the justice system in this country, and how Black people are so disproportionately targeted and imprisoned at higher rates and not given the benefit of the doubt, and so many things. And that's something that King only like dances around a little bit, but like I think becomes more front and center in the movie. My memory of it, at least.
Red being turned into a black man in the film made me think more about this book and how there weren't any black people that are main characters really and aren't really mentioned.
Yeah, it's kind of whitewashed, yeah.
And so, that'll be interesting to watch for when we look at the film and see if we feel like that was a good change for those reasons.
Absolutely. All right. So I do want to give a little announcement here. We talked about it last week, but in case you didn't listen, we are accepting recommendations for TV show adaptations that we're going to cover as our next upcoming quarterly project in the next month or so. So get those recommendations in now. I'll link to it in the show notes. There's a Patreon post. You can comment. It needs to be a book, fiction, and it needs to be the first season of a television show. And we will end up covering that. Normally, we only do films, but we wanted to give TV a try. So if you've been waiting to suggest a TV show for us that you would love to hear us talk about, now's your chance. Get on there, suggest it. Make sure to like any other suggestions that you agree with, like your own suggestion, because we count the number of likes they get to determine which top 4 will enter that final poll, which will be voted on by our patrons. Which I should just go ahead and say, if you want to be able to vote on that final poll and get our bonus content that we release monthly, check out patreon.com/inktofilm and then sign up on there for as little as $2, and you can get all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what, TV shows can be difficult for us, but we felt like it was important for our audience to have the opportunity to pick one. So I'm excited to see.
And we enjoy them. Yeah, we enjoy doing them. They're just longer.
Yeah, television's awesome. I watch TV all the time. There's plenty, golden age of television. There's no question.
And I think honestly, they can sometimes make some of the best adaptations. It really lends itself well. I think the TV format can to especially a longer novel.
It definitely can.
Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. Give us a shout out. Mention this coverage specifically. Let us know you enjoyed it. We'd love to hear from you in that way.
And connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube. We're on YouTube Shorts. So
we're on the street corner, shouting about it. We're everywhere.
Somewhere near Shawshank, near this poop pipe that Andy Dufresne crawled out of. We're right over there too. Come find us.
We're in the standpipe and dairy, offering you a balloon. Yeah, we're everywhere, man. And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music. All right, all that's left is to go to this, multiple award-winning film, and I'm excited to get to it. It's been a long time since I've seen it, so I'm curious to see how it holds up today.
It's funny because there's movies that I've watched many, many times that I feel like when we cover them for the podcast, I'm able to put this capstone on them and say I officially know where I feel about many different aspects that I wouldn't have necessarily dug deeply into.
You're studying it, and I get that, and thinking about it more deeply than usual. You're not just watching it passively.
So I'm excited to put the capstone onto Shawshank, a movie that I feel like I'm very familiar with and like a lot, and now we get to do the deep dive on it.
Yeah. All right. Until next time.
Keep adapting.